There we go. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's time for us to dig back into the text of Judges. I hope everyone has had a wonderful day in the Lord. If your opportunity to worship has included indoor, outdoor, online, or any of the combination of above, I do hope that it has been encouraging and strengthening to your faith in the midst of odd and uncomfortable times. Jared, how you doing?
I'm good. We're in the middle of a nap time stream. This is, key real estate for this is kind of where everybody's really, digging in and ready to be napping as opposed to studying the Bible. But here we are. I was actually talking to Catherine right before I took a short nap right after service this morning. I said, I need to go get a nap in before I go get ready for class. And Catherine goes, classes are over. I was like, I've got the judges thing. She goes, clearly I need a nap as well. So there we have it.
Yeah. Well, I often humorly, maybe self-deprecation, joke that a preacher ought to be able to put a baby to sleep at like 50 yards. That's a good sermon. If you can put a small child to sleep, you've actually been successful in some ways. And so maybe this is a level of increased skill to put adults to sleep at 4 p.m. Eastern time.
I know that Doy Moyer always joked that his favorite thing to do was put on football Sunday afternoon so he could go to sleep. Now there's no football, but Doy, you still have the Warlords study.
That's right. Or maybe people have just listened to Doy's sermon a little bit too much. That'll probably be a good placebo until the football comes back. We'll see if I called him out of the darkness. So we are in chapter 19 of the text of Judges. Before we get into the actual study, now all this banter is away. Jared, could you begin our study in earnest with a word of prayer?
Sure. Lord our God, you have given us everything. Every good and perfect gift comes from you. As we go about our lives, help us to look and see the goodness in your creation. Help us to be some of that goodness in creation, to reflect your light and your life and your care to the rest of the world so that they might not see us, but see you in our actions. Help us as we read in this study this morning, which has so much darkness and so little goodness, to help us to learn from it, to not be like Israel here, to not do what is right in our own eyes, but to do what is right in your sight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So here we go into a couple of things of importance. We're going to talk about some of the larger picture of this book in a second. As we do so, I want to identify a couple of key things. One, as Jared hinted at in his prayer, at least for me, chapters 19 through 21 in the text of Judges is pretty much one of the darkest segments of the Old Testament narrative. It is not happy. It's not, even though there is the thin veneer of good times, they're not really good times at all because they're just hiding the awfulness that is underneath everything. It is full of spiritual rebellion, abuse of mankind, abuse of God's gifts and blessings. And so it really, really is just horrible, for lack of a better term. And so because of that, there's going to be some things that we can learn from this horrible interlude in Israel that are probably going to come like a second layer of gut punches. And Jared, let's talk about a little bit to begin with. I know we kind of planned this out ahead of time, this type of teaching genre, and introduce this part of it for us. Because again, this is not our typical history book. And so what do we have here, and why is that even more important to be aware of now as we begin to close out the text of Judges?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about how the stereotypical, American high school, your history teachers, your gym teacher, football coach kind of history, it's just this memorization of names and dates. And that's not at all really what the biblical history is. I would also suggest to someone who loves history, that's not really what history is at all. But it's especially obvious here because we're about to get into this text, Judges chapter 19, and nobody has a name. And we don't know specifically what date it is. In fact, there's a pretty broad range of dates where people think the book of Judges happens in at all. But instead, we have the Levite, the concubine, the men of the city, the host. Nobody's named. And whenever you see that sort of a thing happening, there's one of several options. But what's going on here in Judges when this is happening is these are not just historical figures, they are types of characters. So this Levite is not just a specific Levite, he is representative of all Levites. This is what Levites in the time of Judges are like, which of course is not good. This woman, she's representative of all women in the time of Judges, and what's going to happen to her is not good. These hosts, these visitors, these Israelites, they're representative of everybody of their nature. That we're going to see when we get to verses 24 and 25, that people are going to do what is right in their own eyes, like what we have with this representative, that in those days there's no king in Israel and everyone does what's right in their own eyes. And we're going to see exactly what that is, and the depths to which people will descend, and what they will sacrifice for their own selves, and what they will consume because it's right in their own eyes. And that, I think this text in a certain way is perhaps the greatest teacher of why we need something better, why we need Jesus, why we need God's ethics and morality, because this is what it looks like when we do what we want.
Right. And this is a timeless story. I think that's another aspect of Judges that's really important. It doesn't matter the time frame this takes place in per se, because the people that God reports to us from Genesis to Jesus, they repeat this behavior. And let me make one more layer of that. We and you and I repeat this behavior in either small ways or big ways, knowingly or unknowingly. And so there's deep learning that we can take from this text and make quick application or long-lasting application of. So let's go ahead and we'll lay some things out. We're going to try to break it down into 3 sections, even though there's probably 2 sections of story, just so we can kind of grapple with it and keep it on the top of our minds. And to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and read verses 1 through 9 for us, and then we'll hop into the next story after that. So starting in Judges chapter 19, verse 1 in the ESV, it reads as follows. In those days there was no king in Israel. A certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her, to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the 4th day they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go. So the 2 of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, be pleased to spend the night. Let your heart be merry. And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day he arose in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines. So they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, behold, now the day has waned toward the evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here, and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey and go home. It sounds so House on the Prairie, Lily White, even on the first reading of it, doesn't they had a fight. He goes to kindly reconcile. Father is so happy to see him, and so whatever that he keeps saying, stay longer, stay longer, stay longer. I'll tell you, though, that without pausing and reflecting, we sometimes miss that there's some subtlety in the story or the narrative that God is telling us that is lost, in part in translation, and in part because we haven't had the Paul Harvey, which is the rest of the story, just yet. So looking at verses, we'll start like maybe 1 to 4, but we're talking about 1 to 9 as a block. What are some things that you see in the text that aren't as obvious on the first reading?
So the first thing is we have this certain Levite, and he's also from the hill country of Ephraim. Well, that should remind us of the certain Levite we've had in the hill country of Ephraim in chapter 17. So we're already should be a little worried about how this is going to play out. But we read that he's got this concubine. Now we got to remember, concubines are not the same as what we might think of in terms of like prostitutes or something like that. That they're not that they're a full legal wife they're married to, but they're without full wife status. Their children can't inherit property. It's a cheaper wife. You don't have to pay as much of a bride price. It's kind of a strange thing to read because we don't read of him having another wife. It's just this one. But the more translation focused issue, and this is, you were reading from the ESV, and the ESV in verse 2 says that his concubine was unfaithful to him. But if we were reading out of some other versions, like the NET, the NET, the New English Translation, or if we were reading out of like the RSV or some other places, they have a different translation of that. And it says, she got angry at her husband and went to her father's house. This is because the Hebrew term zanah, which can be to commit adultery, can also come from a different kind of root, the Akkadian zenu, but we don't have to worry too much about that. But that seems to fit the story better because she hasn't done anything wrong. She, gets mad and she goes home to her parents' house and he stays mad at her for 4 months. But then he kind of brings this, takes servants and donkeys to kind of go back and get to win her back over. That, by the way, is what the Greek translation of Judges has, to get angry. Also, the Aramaic Targum. It's probably the better translation here. Definitely seems to fit the story better. And it ties the behavior to Samson, right? When his churlish behavior, when he has to wait a while and come back with his young goat for his bride.
Yeah, and for everybody's benefit, maybe they don't own the NET. What I've done here is I brought it back out, and I want to preface something in text. You asked us and made the suggestion for folks to read Genesis 19 in advance of this passage. And for those who may not be as familiar with that story, if I show you the heading for the NET translation, it says Sodom and Gomorrah Revisited as its heading inclusion for here in Judges chapter 19. Clearly, the translators of the NET are at least in track with us as to what we're seeing here. And it's actually a pretty well understood perspective to this part of the text of Judges. You may have already recognized it if you had already read those pieces together, but it really kind of repeats that story, which is again a tie-in to our introductory aspect of how this literary method works, history as story or story as history, and what God is trying to teach us here in this text. So we kind of note here in the translation, and we can bring this back up again if we need to read from it later. Maybe we'll read some from the NET later in this text.
Yeah, I definitely would say if people are not familiar with the NET version, it's worth it just for the price. The footnotes alone, they include tons and tons of translators' notes that are very, very good. So if that's something that you're not used to reading, it might be a good version. I always suggest people to change the version they read every few years. They'll bring out different sorts of things. It'd be a good one to add to your stack.
Right, and the online version of it is free.
It is.
It's available in Logos. You can find it in nearly every bookstore, Amazon, all that stuff. It's a great translation, especially, again, because of its value in its notations. It goes in much greater depth as to why they chose a particular sentence structure, word usage to bring out an idea in the passage. Now, here's also what's going on. Besides that marital status, I do think it's super important to see the growing desperation of the father-in-law to continue to say, stay longer, stay longer. There's a disconnect that I see here taking place. Disconnect number one is his intent purpose was to reconcile with his concubine, his wife, We can use those terms for our purposes here interchangeably. And he was going to go reconcile. Whatever the cause of separation was, he's ready to go back. He wants her back. And the father-in-law's behavior is a little sideways. There's a whole lot of the story we don't know. We just know that for some reason, he keeps saying, stay longer. Stay longer. Like, what is it he sees about this Levite that is so important? Like, does he not want his daughter to go away again? Is there something? That's the questions that I ask when I first read through. Like, what's going on? Why is it so imperative for him to stay?
Yeah, and one thing too we're bringing in is it's weird, almost comic over emphasis on hospitality. He's kind of this perfect Uber host who wants to keep on providing for people outside of his own wealth and his own powers and abilities. And that's going to be contrasted on the other side of things and what's going to happen in the rest of the story. That this is a story that is about hospitality. It is about how do you treat someone else. It's about, do you love your neighbor or do you not? And here we have that on the positive side. In a few verses, we're going to see it on the other side.
Right, and the narrative section here that closes out in the verses 9 through 11 time frame is a stay another night. Verse 10, the NET reads, but the man did not want to stay another night. He left and traveled as far as Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a pair of saddle donkeys and his concubine. So he doesn't stay, but he leaves at a time where nothing really good happens at night in the story of Judges for sure. General truth might be there as well, that very few good things happen at night. Especially when your grandma tells you that.
Right. I mean, it's like reading in the Gospel of John when you read, and it was night. That has a theological significance. Right. Or if you're reading in Luke or Mark or Matthew, and it was the Sabbath. Alarm bells need to be going on in your head. When we're so attuned to these sorts of things to be musical, like when you're, the Jaws theme, right? Or you hear the high-pitched violins, something bad's about to happen. Well, they do those same sorts of cues, but they do them through narrative. And so when you read, and it was night, we need to have the hair on the back of our neck start prickling up because we know something bad is about to happen.
Right. So go ahead and let's kind of shift our attention in the story of the text to say verses 10 through 21. It's kind of our next narrative chunk. Jared, do you want to read whatever part of the next 20 verses you want to? Pick and choose as you so deem fit.
Sure. I'll mix storytelling and reading to kind of together, I guess, to merge in that sort of way. But the man wouldn't spend the night. So they rose up and departed and arrived opposite of Jebus, that's Jerusalem. He has a couple donkeys with him. They get close to there, and his servant's like, well, okay, it's getting late. We should stay in Jebus and spend the night, right? You don't want to spend the night outside of a city walls. That's a good way to get killed by robbers and stuff like that. But the master doesn't want to stop in Jebus. He's like, no, those people are not like us. We're not going to go into the city of foreigners. They're not Israelites. They're not going to treat us right. So we're going to go all the way to Gibeah. And Gibeah, of course, is where Saul's from. So they go to Gibeah. They pass along the way. They turn into the side to spend the night at Gibeah there in verse 15. And they sit down in the open square. They're expecting someone to invite them in. No one takes them in for the night. And then we read in verse 16, and behold, an old man was coming in from working the field in the evening. And he was also from the hill country of Ephraim, but he's sojourning in Gibeah. So he's from the same place as this Levite. And he sees the travelers. He's like, where are you going? Where you come from? They're like, well, we're from Bethlehem in Judah. We're looking to where we're going to go. No one's taking us in. We'll pay for our own room and board. We've got our own straw and feed for our donkeys. We will bread and wine. And you know what? Instead of you providing us hospitality, we will pay you hospitality if you just let us stay inside your house. But the old man says, peace to you. Verse 20, I will care for all of your wants. Only don't spend the night in the square. So he brought them into his house, and he gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet, and they ate, and they drank.
So there's a repeat theme in some ways that we can see from the early part of the text. Like there's some storytelling elements that repeat from verses 1 through 9 that reappear. in verses 10 through 21. But they're the highlights of the large echo of the narrative story of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's where the story here draws from. I think Alter says this. I know you and I say the same phrase. This is a subversion of that story, where you're expecting it to kind of play out the same way when you're hearing it, but there's something that's not right. There's something off in the story, because even in verses 1 through 9, like, he's so desperate for them to stay. We don't know why exactly. Superhost, whatever, maybe doesn't want his daughter to go. All those possibilities exist on the table. He goes at the worst time possible to really a place where he doesn't belong. This is not Jerusalem in the sense of David being there or God's people being there. This is the Jebusites. It is not a conquered city. It is not Israelite by any sense or term, and they recognize it. They're like, these aren't our people.
And that's a particularly problematic thing, because we know by the end of chapter 21 that this is less than about a generation at most removed from the conquest. And of course, we've now seen this is the last major city that we have a specific tale about Israel conquering in Joshua, right? We've already seen Hatzor, we've already seen Jericho. Now we see Jerusalem. We have this story about, Caleb and going up and conquering those sorts of things. Well, now, less than a generation removed, it's back in the hands of the Canaanites. That they've completely lost all of the ground that what they were supposed to do in the book of Judges. And he's like, oh, we're not going to go there because we're not going to be safe there. And of course, once we know the story, and we all, I think, know where this is going, you notice the kind of terror that has, that they would have been safer among the Canaanites than they would have been among the Israelites.
Yeah.
That the Israelites are worse than the Canaanites.
So one of the things that's important, and this closes out verses 20, 21, don't stay on the square. Don't stay out in the open. Instead, come inside. He knows that there's risk outside. This foreigner who is sojourning here, he knows it's not safe for them to be there. And at this point, there's no fault on his table. Like, he's making a good choice for them.
He's doing what he's supposed to do.
He's being hospitable. He rejected their offer of, we'll pay for it. No, I'll take care of everything. It'll be okay. Their behavior is on the up and up too. Like, they say, hey, we'll pay for our own. They go in expecting hospitality. It's a biblical principle in the Old Testament. There's an expectation of caring for sojourners, travelers going through your community. It's covenant expected. It's just practically relationship expected from the general tone of the law, that you care for one another's needs and circumstances. And he goes even a little bit further in the text as we begin to kind of see the stage open up. As the story continues in verse 22, it had shifted. But in verses 16 to 21, he's washing feet. He's providing food for them. But there's something that appears, verse 21, that begins this downward spiral. It's a regular event in the Old Testament as well. I think it's probably good for us maybe right now to go ahead and read through the last chunk. So I'm going to pick up in verse 22 for right now. And actually, I'm only going to read right now just through verse 26. We'll break that up into two sections because we've got a good amount of time to appropriate for that. So beginning verse 22, chapter 19. As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and my concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. As the morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the master's house where her master was until it was light. Um, I got to tell you, that's just like one of the most awful sections of Judges. Um, Even before we unpack the theological significance and the practical instruction there, um, it's just terrible. I got nothing else for it.
There's no redeeming this section. Uh, and I think that it's important for us to realize what we're waiting for in the back of our minds. You know, we've mentioned, and I'm going to throw up in the chat as well, some of the specifics, the connections between Judges 19 and Genesis 19. There's a lot of very, very explicit connections. And we recognize that this is exactly what happened in Genesis 19, right? That we've got these same sort of situations that occur where you get two travelers who arrive to a city. They arrive at evening. The travelers are strangers. They decide to sleep in the city square. A host invites them in. The host washes their feet, gives them a meal. Depraved men surround the house, and they demand the male guest of the house, right? And the host is like, no, don't do this wicked thing. And you remember what happens, of course, in Genesis is Lot's like, hey, I'll take my daughters, right? But then who are the two visitors in Genesis? Well, they're not powerless people. They're angels.
Mm-hmm.
And the angels save Lot and they save his family. And what we're waiting for here in this text, what we should be longing for, is God's intervention. And we don't get it.
No.
It's a lot like what we saw in Jephthah with the echoes of Abraham and Isaac, that what we expect is God's angels say, don't kill the child. Here's a substitute. Here's this ram with his horns cut. And we don't get it. And we don't get it here either.
Right. It's important to the text here is ambiguous as to who does the second half of the behavior. It doesn't tell us if it was the man who had the home, the Levite who engaged in this decision. But either way, it's there's layers of despicableness. Why not fight? Why not flee? These are all options that are theoretically on the table. Why? And this is the whole narrative arc that makes me go back to the introduction of the story. He wants to reconcile. The father begs him to stay. Everything seems so rosy and beautiful and Little House on the Prairie. And then it's absolutely not. And the person you're expecting to be the hero never comes. And nobody rises to be the hero. There's no like, okay, they finally come around and they have a turn of the story where the anti-hero becomes the hero. There's none of that. It closes with darkness, where it was night fell in the text, and then she returns to the doorstep until it was light. And the sun rises on the scene, and she, like other women in the text of Judges, and like other women and people throughout history, have been sacrificed to the God of a person's heart and desires. Whether it's safety or pleasure, she's basically been tossed to the curb. And protect us with your body instead of me protecting you with mine.
Yeah, and we see exactly that is what's going on, and what the image that we have in Judges is because, right, she as morning appears, she falls down at the edge of the house where the man's master was until it was light. She's there for a little while, and instead he's not waiting for her. He's not in anguish on the other side. Instead, we have this image of he just keeps on eating and drinking and is merry and is feasting, and could not care less that she is another sacrifice like what we've seen. She is sacrificed like Jephthah's daughter. She is sacrificed like Samson's first wife, right? That she is sacrificed here now by her husband himself, by a Levite. And when you connect this idea, this concept of sacrifice with a Levite, that's obviously what we're supposed to do, because what do Levites do? Well, they make sacrifices. But here it's not a sacrifice to God. It's a sacrifice to himself. And it's a human sacrifice to himself, even if this is, in this case, a metaphorical sacrifice.
Right. And it's very obvious that the father-in-law loves the Levite more than the Levite loves the daughter.
I mean, that's a low bar, but absolutely.
Further, it makes me question whether the father-in-law loves the daughter.
I mean,
That's
one thing we have to realize about the time in which the Bible's written, the culture in which the Bible's written, not the Bible's culture, but the culture in which the Bible's written, is women are not valued. They're not, right? They are treated as barely better than slaves, and slaves are just property who can speak. Aristotle
yeah,
called them property who can move, right? Movable property. And that's exactly what we see here.
right.
It's exactly what we see here.
Which is, and this is a point that you made that I want to kind of double down on. It's not the Bible's instruction that's producing this. It is the culture that surrounds them. Further, the culture of every nation struggles with this, just as modern culture struggles with this. God doesn't want it then, nor does he want it now, where people of either gender are treated as disposable. And you do see men being disposed of in some same ways in the Old Testament, as well as in the New Testament to some degrees as well, treated as commodities. Slave culture was huge in the first century, of various types of slavery that have their own impacts. So that brings us to the closing refrains, and we're going to repeat verse 26 to close out this last section. But Jared, do you want to go ahead and read that 26 through the close of the text?
30, yeah.
Yeah.
And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning. And when he opened up the doors of the house and he went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands stretched onto the threshold. And he said to her, "Get up, go." There was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man got up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of the concubine, he cut her up limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak."
You think about the impact that that can have on Israel as human parts are sent to the tribes, as any level of whatever you think is going on here. Very certainly, I think it's easy to say that what he wanted was to go to war. I don't think he was seeking justice for her, though. I think the text is telling us that his justice is for him.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see that very clearly in chapter 20. And to kind of preview that just a little bit, I want to ask everybody to think about this and look at the text and consider what you think. Is she dead when he gets to her? Or is she not? But yeah, you mentioned that this is a kind of a summons to war. That's absolutely the case. We have a Mari text, which is an ancient culture very close to Israel, a little farther north. And it says, "Now if I had my way, a prisoner in jail should be killed and his body dismembered and transported to the area that he was from, so that the people would fear and gather for war quickly." That's the Mari text of Bagdi Lim. We're actually going to see this, and this is one of the redeeming aspects, one of the very few redeeming aspects of the story. Remember, what village is this where this is happening? What village is it where the people come and destroy this woman and this man?
So I was fixing something, so back it up again. I heard the what village statement.
Yeah, what village is this? Where does this happen?
Well, from where we're at right now, this is Gibna.
It's Gibeah. Who's from Gibeah? Who's the most famous person from Gibeah in our Bible story?
Well,
I could tell you were looking somewhere else, so I pounced on weakness.
You do this to me we just talked about this. So Gibeah, let's see. Is it David?
What village is it? No.
Oh, my brain is really broken right now.
It's Saul,
Saul,
right?
that's okay.
Saul is from
Look at the
Gibeah.
right two guys.
I know, right? You're close. You're close. It's Saul because this is in Benjamin. It's Gibeah of Benjamin. Now you remember when there's a particular people, the people of Jabesh Gilead in 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 11 are in danger.
Yeah,
Do you remember what he does to summon all the people to war to defend them? He takes an oxen and he chops them up into pieces and sends them out.
right.
That's his connection to Gibeah.
Yeah.
One of the, I have a soft spot in my heart for Saul with all of his problems. But one of the things he does is he's actually learned from the story in Jabesh Gilead. That's going to show up a little bit later in our story as well. But yeah, it's a summons to war, and it's a summons to defend his own personal honor,
Right.
not hers.
And in this whole narrative, and we kind of back it up, we've connected it to Genesis 9 and Genesis 19, and how that intertextually connects to the story of what's going on here. And I think we also want to do the last couple steps. We've already been hinting at it. Gibeah serves as Sodom in this. Israel is Canaan. And then Jerusalem and Bethlehem kind of come into play. And I think this is one, I kind of identified this earlier. This is an instance where male leadership fails to lead. And I'm going to do something I haven't done a whole lot of in Judges, but I'm going to do it right now. And it's a echo of the garden, where there is a subjugation of leadership and a switch of relationship. And there's a whole lot that goes on in the curse and blessing commentary of God, Adam, and Eve that's important for us to understand right now. And the out of order events that take place in Genesis, Eve's punishment in part is a result of her seemingly rushing to the front and swishing those roles, and Adam's reluctance to lead. And she takes the lead in those roles, and so you have that flip of relationship. Well, here in this text, the men are definitely leading, but look at how they lead. All the dudes are in charge, but they're horrible at it, like by every single standard. And so I think this is a kind of a way for us to think through the absence of genuine God kingship in Israel. That it is not the patriarchy, nor the matriarchy that is the solution to the problem. If women are in charge, it doesn't make it any better. If men are in charge, it doesn't make it any better. The problem was they had allowed themselves to shift really far away from God being in charge. And I think at least on the textual level, this is what is partially important for us.
Yeah, and I think that's, to push it a little further, this is something we've been seeing from the beginning of the book of Judges, right? Is that we've seen, so for example, if we go all the way back to the beginning of the book of Judges, where we have, Barak won't stand up, so Deborah has to do it for him, and Jael has to kill the bad guy. That's a failure of male leadership in the case. And we're saying, well, women are leading. That's and of course, some people say, well, that's a real problem. Well, here, what we see is that the natural conclusion to that sort of thing, that these men in these stories at the end, they're not willing to raise their standard in order to lead women who are strong like Deborah and lead women who are strong like Jael, and to be better than them. So instead, they have to crush the women around them and sacrifice them. We have this term that gotten really popular, right, in today's culture, toxic masculinity. And some people are like, oh, that's that they want to react to that because they see in it, for better or for worse, right, this sort of feminist agenda. But you can't read Judges without realizing this is toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a real thing, and that is completely opposed to everything the Bible teaches. And that can't be what we see as the culture, the Bible's culture for men and women, because this right here, this ain't it, right? Judges 19, that's not it.
And then now this fits in the bigger structure, and we've shown this before, so now we're going to bring up a couple of things to tie this all together. We've returned to the scheme right here. This is the funnel and the ring structure that we've got up right now. And so this is in the epilogue section of the text, but it also finds its space in the ring structure as echoing some of the early events of Othniel to a certain degree, all the way from Othniel to Samson. These are echoes of each of those things. As much as the ring structure or the funnel try to make some sense of the text, that's all now coming to roost. Each of these story elements that the grandpa has been telling his grandson, which is important in part because of what's going on in the next phase of these things, is going to be super important for us, a super important lead in to chapter 20 and 21 to see how this all turns around. I also wanted to cite this. I know we had mentioned at the beginning. It's not really specifically identified for us when this particular story takes place in the Judges period. And I'm using that very loosely, the period of the Judges, because we don't know exactly all the details for when all of this happens. But it happens narratively in the storytelling at the end, and it's supposed to drive our hearts to the final outcome of where is God? Like that's part of this story. Like right now, like you're waiting for that Savior to come. Why wasn't she saved? Why aren't we being saved is the next layer of it. Because you think about the grandson who might be going into captivity, or you and I who might be struggling spiritually. We read this text and it's like, where's God for me? Where's God for me in all this? Because that's one of the truths that is undergirding this. Like, where is Jehovah? Where is Elohim? And then you look around and go, wait a minute, I'm not where I need to be. It's not so much that he has left them, but they have left him. And sometimes we have left him, or I have left him, as kind of the epilogue's nail in the coffin at the end of it. So what else is there anything else in this section that we want to make note of before we close out?
Like you said, this is just wrapping everything up. One other thing that's probably worthwhile to note is how this is putting together a bunch of different streams, right? That if Gibeah is Sodom and Israel's Canaan, we know they're going to be destroyed, right? God destroys. Remember, he sends in Genesis chapter 18 and chapter 19, he's sending the angels to see whether Sodom and Gomorrah are as wicked as he's heard. He finds out, of course, that they are, and they're going to be annihilated. Well, here we're going to see that Gibeah also and Benjamin are going to be annihilated, but it's in the story of how the first readers of the book of Judges are going to read. The implication is clear. Israel is going to be destroyed. And it doesn't matter if it's Bethlehem, which is where, of course, David's from. It doesn't matter if it's Gibeah, where Saul's from. The monarchy is just as wicked as everybody else. This is everything gone bad. It's that fatal funnel. And we're going to be seeing all that wrap up together in what we do on Sunday or on Wednesday.
Right, Wednesday.
Days are hard.
The days don't matter anymore, as one of my children said early on in the self-isolation, self-quarantine, whatever you want to call it, phase. Great study today. Hope everyone really enjoyed walking through the text. Quick comment. Jared loves to pounce when I get distracted and ask questions.
It's my teacher heart. I can't help it.
I refuse to cheat. I have the notes that would give me the answer.
My notes. You've got my notes.
I do. I could just scroll and find it, but I refuse to give in to the easy side of things. But I want to make a point about that. The Bible is a rich book, and you read it time and time and again, and you remember and you forget things, and it's totally okay. I'm not bothered by it at all. I know other folks you don't know the answer to that. Of course I don't. I'm not going to pretend
that everything, right? That's why we have notes.
That's why we have lots of notes. You should see how many notes I have open to teach this class and how much effort we go into that on that side of things. But it's totally okay, and it's fun. I still have my hairline for now. Jared's hairline is in a new zip code, and so we like to pick on each other, and we're content with it. We hope everyone else enjoys the study, and maybe this will keep you awake too. We maybe subverted nap time for a little bit longer. But again, we're going to meet Wednesday evening for the study at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. If you've got questions about this text or what we're going into in chapters 20 and 21, I also want to kind of encourage you to kind of look back to Joshua. Joshua's got some stories that are important for us to see the latter part of Joshua, like the last 3 or 4 chapters, if you want to kind of read ahead to get ready for this class. That's an important thing to reread the end of the conquest. Then the Sunday following that, I think we're going to wrap up the text of Judges, and then Hebrews, and then Ruth is our current plan, and we don't know what happens after that. Kind of like everybody else on the planet. We're just kind of playing it as far out as we can see it. So at this time, we'll close out our study with prayer, and we're very thankful for your participation and your presence here. But let's bow our hearts and ourselves in front of our Maker. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for the blessing that it is to walk in the kingdom. We ask that you watch over our souls, that you keep us mindful and prepared for what the journey ahead of us looks like. If it is your desire to prepare your people to be able to endure the future, then let us have whatever suffering we need to prepare with endurance for the journey ahead. If you decide to bless us, let us rejoice and honor you. For whatever state we find ourselves in, whether to be blessed or cursed, whether to be benefited or pushed away, we desire to do so to your glory. Allow our lives to be poured out to you as an offering, and in all of our service, may you be honored and glorified. And this is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.